Lone Mesa, New Mexico Territory winter, 1881. The wind was a living thing that winter. It moved like memories slow bitter, and full of voices that didn't belong to this world anymore. The mesa stood wide and red beneath a bruised sky, the kind of land that forgave nothing. Thomas Mercer had lived there alone for 6 years. He spoke to his horses more than to people, and even the horses seemed tired of listening. The war had taken most of what he was. The rest he buried here under cedar roots, under silence, under dust. Each morning he rose before dawn, lit the stove with shaking hands, and waited for coffee to boil. The sound of fire was the only voice he trusted. He patched fences that never stayed whole, mended tools that didn't need fixing, built order where there was none. Some nights he would sit on the porch, watching the line of the horizon fade into smoke. Out there the world still argued, men killing for land, for railroads, for pride. He had done his share once. He didn't plan to again. The locals in town said the mesa was haunted. Maybe it was. Some nights Thomas swore the wind spoke Apache words he half remembered from the campaigns. Words that sounded like prayers or maybe warnings. He had stopped trying to understand them. That morning, the sky was pale and cruel. Frost rimed the troughs, and the cattle bawled low from the ravine. Thomas adjusted his hat, tightened his coat, and walked toward the corral. He thought it would be another day of mending rails and counting hours. He was wrong. If you're still here, take a breath, friend. Tell me where you're listening from. And drop a 1-inch the comments. The wind at Lone Mesa's only just begun to change. It started with blood on the snow. Not much, just a streak, then another, thin as a thread. He might have missed it if not for the crows. They circled low black wings cutting through the pale light. Thomas followed the trail up the ridge, rifles slung low, boots breaking the crust of ice. The sun was still weak, dragging itself over the rocks. Every sound felt too sharp, the crunch of frost, the rasp of his breath, the silence after. She was lying in the shadow of a juniper, half covered by sand and snow, barefoot, wounded, wrapped in what was left of a deerskin shawl. For a long moment Thomas just stood there. She was young, maybe 25, skin the color of red earth, hair tangled and dusted with frost, a cut running down her arm. Her chest rose faintly, alive but barely. He knelt beside her, hesitated, then brushed the snow from her cheek. Her eyes flickered open, dark wide, full of distrust. She flinched when he touched her. "It's all right," he muttered, though he wasn't sure it was. "You're safe." Her lips parted, a word forming but lost to the wind. Then softer, almost broken. "Don't take me back." Thomas frowned. Back where? But she was already slipping under again, her breath, shallow fingers clutching the earth as if it could hide her. He looked down at her hands, scarred, burned strong. Not the hands of a helpless woman. She had fought for her life, and maybe for something more. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of iron and smoke from the valley below. He knew that scent. Men had been riding. Thomas lifted her gently, careful of her arm. She was light, too light. He draped his coat around her shoulders and started back toward the ranch. Behind him, the crows settled on the snow, picking at something he chose not to see. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had gone dark again. The fire caught slow, reluctant, like it didn't trust warmth anymore. He laid her near the hearth, wrapped her in a blanket, and waited for her to breathe steady. Her skin was cold as stone, but there was a pulse, faint but stubborn. "Who are you?" he whispered. Outside, the wind answered instead. Night fell hard on Lone Mesa. The wind combed through the cedar trees like a restless spirit, shaking loose needles that hissed against the cabin walls. Inside, Thomas fed small sticks into the stove and listened to them crackle. The sound steadied him. Fire was the only thing that still obeyed him. The woman slept fitfully. Fever rose under her skin. Sweat and cold battled on her brow. He soaked a rag in cool water, pressed it to her head, changed the bandage on her arm. She flinched once, but didn't wake. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, like a fire trying to hold against wind. Near midnight, she stirred, whispering words in a tongue he halfway knew. Apache. Fragments of prayer, maybe. He caught a single one, Nizhoni, then silence. When she opened her eyes again, she watched the ceiling beams, as if memorizing their pattern in case she had to flee through them. "You're safe here," he said. She turned her head wary. "You lie." He shook his head. "Not tonight." For a while neither spoke. Wind pressed against the windows. Sparks chased each other up the chimney. He poured her a tin cup of water and held it out. She stared at it, then at him, before taking a slow sip. Her throat moved like a bird learning to swallow again. "Why help me?" she asked finally. He looked into the fire. "Because once someone helped me. I still owe the debt." Her eyes softened only slightly. Then the fever took her again. She slept until dawn. When morning came, frost clung to the inside of the windows, drawing white branches across the glass. Thomas stepped outside to feed the horse, and for the first time in years, left the cabin door open behind him. The air inside smelled of smoked cedar and something human. The second morning her fever broke. Not cleanly, but like ice thawing in uneven patches. She woke slow, blinking at the pale light leaking through the curtains. He was by the stove again, scraping the last of last night's stew into a tin bowl. When he noticed her watching, he nodded once, neither kind nor cold. "You'll need to eat," he said. She tried to sit up, winced, and pressed a hand to her ribs. The wound had stiffened overnight. Thomas crossed the room, set the bowl near her, and waited until she took the spoon herself. Pride could be stronger than pain, he knew that much. She ate slow, as if testing each bite against her will to survive. When the bowl was empty, she leaned back, eyes half shut, whispering something that sounded like thanks. He didn't answer. He was already at the window, watching the line of hills that marked the southern edge of the mesa. The world looked washed out and endless. The sky stretched thin like hammered tin. Snow lingered in the hollows, blue in shadow. He'd seen that color before on faces of men half frozen, not ready to die but too tired to stand. When he turned back, she was asleep again. He pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders. Her braid had come undone, strands of black hair, tangled against the wool. He thought of cutting the frayed ends, but decided against it. Some things a person ought to mend on their own. By the third day she could stand. Barefoot on the plank floor, she leaned against the table for balance, breathing hard but steady. He watched from the doorway, not speaking, only noting the small details that marked the living from the dying. The way her fingers gripped the edge of the table, the color returning to her lips, the defiance that replaced fever. "You don't have to prove anything," he said quietly. Her eyes met his. "I do." Outside, the wind had shifted. A hawk cried over the ridge, the sound slicing through the cold like a blade. He handed her a wool coat, one of his spares. She took it, smelled the smoke in its fabric, and slipped her arms through without a word. They stepped outside together. The snow was crusted hard, glittering beneath a sky the color of pewter. The cedar grove leaned under frost branches heavy. Thomas moved toward the corral, tossing hay to the horse. She followed a few paces behind, stooping once to touch the frozen ground. "Cold," she said, voice hoarse. "It'll warm by noon. You always alone, most days." She nodded, as if confirming a truth she already knew. Her breath fogged between them. For a moment, the land itself seemed to listen to their silence, to the quiet clatter of the pail, to the unspoken thing that had begun to grow between two people who had no reason to trust each other but the simplest one need. That night, the storm returned. It came low and sudden, crawling down from the high ridge like a pack of wolves. Wind slammed the shutters. The roof moaned. Thomas stacked more wood into the stove until the cabin glowed red at its center. She sat near the fire, wrapped in his coat, the hem dragging across the floor. Her eyes followed the sparks that leapt and died. He fixed a lantern, checked the rifle by the door habits older than peace. When he glanced back, she was tracing her finger through the ash, near the hearth, drawing lines and circles. He recognized one, a sun symbol common to her people. "What's that mean?" he asked. She looked up. "Home." He stared at the mark. "You think you'll find it?" "I think I'll build it," she said, then smudged the drawing away with her palm. Ash streaked her skin. "If I live?" Thomas nodded once, understanding that kind of faith, the kind that didn't ask for proof, only persistence. Then I'll see that you do. Her gaze flicked to him, sharp, measuring. You don't owe me. He poured coffee into a tin mug, set it beside her. Didn't say I did. She studied him for a long while, then sipped the coffee. Steam rose between them like a thin veil. What was her name? She asked finally. He froze halfway to the door. Who, the one you owe? He sat down the floor, creaking beneath his weight. Mary, he said after a moment. She pulled me out of a canyon once. My horse broke a leg. I'd have died down there if she hadn't come looking. She your wife? He shook his head. Just someone better than I deserved. The wind rattled the chimney. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up into the dark. She nodded, satisfied. Then I'll live, she murmured. So your debt is paid. Before dawn, he woke to the sound of the pump handle groaning. The woman Nizhoni was outside, wrapped in a blanket, drawing water from the well. The sky was pale with frostlight. Her movements were slow but sure practiced. He watched from the window as she filled a tin basin, her breath rising in white curls. He went out and took the handle when her arms began to tremble. She didn't protest, only stepped aside and rubbed warmth back into her fingers. They worked in silence, the rhythm of the pump filling the quiet between them. When the basin was full, she lifted it together with him, their hands brushing at the rim. The touch was brief, accidental, but neither pulled away too fast. Inside, she boiled the water on the stove, the scent of cedar smoke thick in the air. He cleaned his rifle. The domestic sound, the hiss of water, the click of metal felt almost like music, something forgotten and found again. When the fire settled low, she asked, "What will you do when I leave?" He shrugged. "Keep living." That is not answer. He looked at her, then really looked at the scar running from her wrist to elbow, at the bruise fading beneath her collarbone, at the stubborn line of her mouth. "Maybe it is," he said. "Sometimes that's all there is." She studied him, then nodded. "Then I live too." The storm broke on the fifth night. Snow melted from the eaves in slow, rhythmic drops. Thomas opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was clean sharp with pine and thaw. He could see farther than he had in months, the whole basin spread wide, streaked with silver creeks and patches of winter grass. Behind him, the sound of movement, bare feet on wood. She came to stand beside him, the blanket still around her shoulders. The wind tugged at her hair. For a long moment they said nothing. The land stretched before them, silent and alive. "This place," she said quietly. "It's not yours." "No one's," he replied. "That's why I came." She turned her face toward the sun, just lifting over the ridge. "Then maybe it's both." He didn't argue. The light caught on her cheek, softening the edges of her face. He felt something in his chest loosen an ache he'd mistaken for hunger or cold. It wasn't either. It was the first stirrings of peace. That night, when she lay down by the stove, he didn't sit guard at the door. He stayed beside the fire until sleep found him too. Outside, the wind eased through the cedar trees, no longer howling, just whispering. The world was still rough and uncertain, but in that small cabin on Lone Mesa, something fragile had taken root like fire, coaxed from damp wood like a heart relearning its beat. And when dawn came, Thomas Mercer stepped outside to feed the horse, and for the first time in years, left the cabin door open behind him. Inside, the air smelled of smoked cedar and something he hadn't dared name in a long time: hope. Days lengthened, slow and quiet. The kind of days that passed, not in hours, but in small labors, the swing of an axe, the hiss of water on iron, the murmur of wind through grass. Nizhoni healed by degrees. The wound on her arm closed, clean, but left a dark seam across the skin, a mark the color of weathered wood. She carried it without shame, as if scars were another kind of language. Each morning she rose earlier, finding her way through the cabin's order, sweeping dust from the corners, boiling water, mending the torn blanket. Thomas kept to his own rhythm. He fixed the fence that had slumped under last winter's wind, sharpened the edge of the spade, repaired the saddle straps that mice had chewed. He worked without haste and without plan. She moved around him in silence, never close enough to touch, never far enough to forget he was there. Trust did not arrive as a feeling. It appeared in the rhythm of chores. He left the rifle on the table instead of on his belt. She poured him coffee without waiting to be asked. When he passed her, a hammer their fingers brushed. Both pretended it hadn't happened. Yet the touch lingered longer than either expected. When the wind grew too strong, they worked inside her, stitching near the firelight, him carving wooden pegs by the window. The only sound was the scrape of blade against wood and the faint creak of the chair whenever she shifted her weight. Some nights he caught himself glancing at her reflection in the window pane, the slope of her shoulders, the steadiness in her hands. One afternoon he found her kneeling in the yard, palms pressed flat to the soil. The sky above was silver, full of wind. She stayed that way for a long time, whispering words too low for him to catch. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to call out. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clear, the fever long gone. "What were you saying?" he asked. She brushed dirt from her fingers. "When the land hears your name, it remembers how you walk." He frowned lightly, not mocking, only curious. "And you told it mine?" "Yes," she said simply. "I told it you mean no harm." Thomas looked toward the hills. "Does it believe you?" "Maybe not yet," she said. "But it will." The ground between them felt different. After that, less like distance, more like shared territory. They built a small corral together. He measured the line, she carried the posts. The sun burned high, the air dry as iron filings. Sweat rolled down their necks, dust streaked their arms. The rhythm of their labor settled into a kind of language, the thud of hammer, the rasp of rope, the low breath between strikes. When her hands blistered, she said nothing. Thomas noticed only when she paused, wiping her palms against her skirt. He walked to the cabin, tore a strip from his old flannel shirt, and returned with it. "Hold still," he said. She obeyed, wary, but not afraid. He wrapped her palms carefully, the fabric rough but clean. His fingers brushed the pulse at her wrist. "That should keep," he murmured. She didn't thank him. She just nodded and went back to work. But that night, when he came in from the yard, a small stone sat on the table, smooth gray, carved with a spiral. He recognized it as an offering, maybe even a promise. He didn't touch it. He only looked at it before blowing out the lantern. The next morning began with fog thin as smoke over the grass. Nizhoni was already outside, crouched by the well, drawing water. Her hair was damp from mist. Thomas watched her pour the first bucket into the trough, then another. She moved with the patience of someone who had learned to outlast silence. "You work like you've been here all your life," he said. "I have worked all my life," she answered. He half smiled. "Then we're the same." She shook her head gently. "No, you work to forget. I work to remember." He didn't ask what she meant, but the words followed him through the day. By noon the fog had lifted, leaving the land bright and raw. They hauled timbers to the corral, their shadows long and sharp against the ground. Once, when he slipped on loose gravel, she caught his elbow before he fell. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. He muttered, "Thanks." She let go. "You are welcome." It was the first time she had said it without hesitation, and somehow it felt heavier than the boards they carried. At dusk, he taught her how to split kindling. She swung the hatchet clean too close to her knee. He reached out, covering her wrist, guiding her motion. "Like this," he said, his voice low. "Let the weight do the work." She adjusted, tried again. The wood split neat. She smiled, small but real. "Good," he said. "Better teacher than soldier," she replied. He looked up, surprised, she knew. "You heard that you talk and sleep," she said, still splitting. He didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't uneasy, just honest. The sound of chopping filled it until the stars came out. Some evenings, when the work was done and the air cooled, Nizhoni would hum. The melody carried no words, just a long, soft rise and fall like wind weaving through canyon walls. Thomas never asked what it meant. He only listened. It filled the cracks that silence had carved inside him, smoothing the rough edges. One night, as the fire dimmed, he said quietly, "That song, it sounds like water." She tilted her head. "It's a song for healing." He nodded slowly. "It's working." Her eyes flicked to his. "On you, maybe both of us." They didn't speak after that. The melody faded, leaving behind something gentler than quiet. By the end of the week, the corral stood finished. The posts gleamed pale in the evening light. They stood side by side on the porch, watching the last dust settle. The sky bled into copper. The wind had gone soft, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen in months. A single cloud hung over the mesa, lit from beneath like an ember. Thomas leaned on the rail. "You can leave when you're ready," he said. "I know," she answered. Then, after a pause, "Maybe not yet." He looked at her. "You think the land told you that?" She smiled faintly. "The land doesn't tell. It listens." He nodded. "Then it's listening to us both." That night, thunder rolled far off, more promise than storm. Thomas sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. Nizhoni sat across from him, weaving a strip of rawhide into a cord. The rhythm of their small sounds, the scrape of steel, the whisper of fiber, was as steady as a heartbeat. When she finished, she held the cord out. "For you," she said. He took it, turned it in his fingers. "What for?" "To tie your tools," she said. Then softer, "Or to remember who tied it." He looked up, and for a moment the space between them disappeared. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, eyes on the fire. "You're welcome." Outside, wind lifted a swirl of dust across the porch. Inside, the embers glowed deep and soft against the walls. The next morning brought a break in the weather. Clouds gathered at the rim of the mesa, gray and heavy. They worked fast, covering wood, pulling the tarp over the hay. When the first drops fell, they stood in the doorway, breathless and soaked. Rain came down, hard, drumming on the roof, running in silver streaks across the glass. Nizhoni lifted her face toward it, eyes closed. "First rain since spring," Thomas said. "It's good," she murmured. "The land remembers now." He watched her smile, quiet, certain, and felt something move in his chest, the way roots move under soil when they find water again. When night returned, the rain had stopped. The air was cool, smelling of wet cedar. They sat on the porch, watching mist curl through the grass. The corral glistened in the moonlight, each post dark and shining. She said softly, "My father built fences too, not to keep people in or out, to tell the land where it had been loved." Thomas glanced at her. "And this one?" She looked out at the posts, the gate, the damp earth beneath their feet. "This one will remember us." He didn't argue. The idea felt right. The stars broke through the thinning clouds. Somewhere far off, coyotes called across the valley. Nizhoni drew her knees up, resting her chin on them. "Do you ever think the world ends where you stop walking?" He thought a long time before answering. "Used to, not anymore." "Why?" "Because you keep walking." She smiled at that, quiet and full. They stayed like that for a long while, two silhouettes on the porch, framed by moonlight and the scent of rain. The land around them, raw and scarred, seemed to exhale. In the morning, the sun rose gold over Lone Mesa. The earth steamed alive again. Thomas stepped into the yard boots, sinking slightly in the softened soil. Nizhoni followed her bare feet, leaving faint prints beside his. Neither spoke. The world didn't need words that day. The fence stood straight. The tools were hung. The horse stamped and snorted in the new corral. And for the first time since either could remember, work no longer felt like survival. It felt like belonging. The storm didn't come from the sky at first. It came from the road. That afternoon, the air hung heavy, the kind of stillness that makes animals restless long before men notice. Nizhoni was hanging wet cloth near the corral when the horses began to shift uneasily. Their ears flicked east toward the ridge where the trail cut through the mesquite. The wind changed direction, carrying dust. Then the smell of iron. Then something meaner. Thomas came out of the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. He caught the tremor in the air before he saw the riders. The light itself seemed to harden, flattening the distance into a single shimmer. Two shapes moved through it, first one rider, then another, behind him, slow and deliberate. "They found you," Thomas said quietly. Nizhoni didn't answer. She stepped back toward the porch, her hand tightening around the wooden rail. The sky behind her was the color of pewter, bright yet cold. When the riders came close enough to see their faces were wrong for the land. One was older, thin, and sunburned, his beard patchy, his eyes pale as milk. The other wore a trader's vest over a stained white shirt. The kind of man who bought and sold anything that couldn't fight back. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He had known men like that during the campaigns, men who called it duty when it was cruelty, who spoke of justice with blood still on their hands. The trader lifted his hand in mock greeting. "Afternoon, Mercer. Fine place you got here. Shame to see it wasted on strays." Thomas said nothing. "We're looking for a woman," the man continued. "Apache scar on her arm. Belongs to us." "She belongs to no one," Thomas said. The older man laughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to scrape the inside of the air. "You got soft living out here, soldier. Heard you used to know how to follow orders." Thomas stepped off the porch boots, crunching against the grit. That was a long time ago. The trader's horse sidestepped, snorting. "Ain't talking about orders," he said. "Talking about what's right." She ran off from the folks that bought her fair papers signed in Tucson. Costs money when property disappears. He said the word property, the way a man might say mule. Thomas's voice was quiet, but it cut clean. "You'll ride back the way you came. Not without her." The sun was dropping fast now, the light turning copper and blood. Shadows stretched long between them. The trader spat into the dirt. "We got law on our side. You hand her over, and we'll be gone before dark." "The law, I know, doesn't sell people." The older man shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking toward the rifle leaning near the porch. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, old man." From behind Thomas came Nizhoni's voice, low, steady. "You already made it hard when you took what was never yours." They turned toward her, sneering. The trader's smile vanished. "There's the little thief." His hand dropped toward his holster. Thomas moved first. The rifle came up in one fluid motion, the sound of the lever echoing across the yard. "You'll ride away now," he said through his teeth. The silence that followed was thick as heat. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The trader met Thomas's eyes for a long, measuring second, then eased his reins. "This ain't over," he muttered. "I know," Thomas said. Dust rose behind the horses as they backed away, then turned galloping toward the ridge. When they disappeared, the wind returned stronger, colder, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder. Nizhoni stood beside him, her hands trembling, though her face did not show it. "They will return," she said. Thomas nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That night, the mesa was restless. The clouds gathered low and dark, lit now and then by distant flashes that never quite became thunder. Thomas checked the rifle, then the revolver, then every shutter on the cabin. He moved with quiet efficiency, the kind of calm that only comes to men who have seen what panic costs. Nizhoni watched from near the hearth. She had built the fire high, and the flames painted the walls in shifting orange light. "You fought before," she said. He nodded. "Too many times." For what he hesitated. A flag, a promise that kept changing names. She studied him. "And now I fight for what's mine." She said nothing more, but her eyes softened, as if the words had given shape to something she already believed. Toward midnight, the wind rose. The door creaked on its hinges. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote yipped once and went silent. Thomas stoked the fire again. "If they come, they'll wait for dark to help them." "They won't come alone," Nizhoni said. He looked at her, impressed by the certainty in her voice. "How many? 3, maybe 4. The trader has friends. He pays with silver and whiskey. Those buy quick loyalties." He nodded. "Then we'll need to make the land work for us." They went out together, lanterns low. The air was sharp with the scent of rain and juniper. Thomas strung a line of wire along the corral gate, then checked the barn doors, the window latches. Nizhoni moved ahead of him, spreading handfuls of sand across the porch floor to muffle their steps. When they were done, he said, "Go inside. Try to rest." She shook her head. "You rest. I will listen." Her tone left no room for argument. So he let her take first watch. She sat by the window, the rifle across her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. Thomas dozed by the stove, one hand still on the revolver. The storm came just before dawn. The first clap of thunder woke him. The second rolled long and deep, shaking dust from the rafters. Rain followed, hard, sudden drumming on the roof in sheets. He rose fast, scanning the yard through the streaked window. For a moment all he saw was rain. Then through the blur a shape moved, then another. Horses low against the wind, shadows between flashes of lightning. "They're here," he said. Nizhoni was already standing. Thomas handed her the spare rifle. "Stay low." If they try the barn fire once and move. She nodded, no fear in her face, only focus. You take the door. The first bullet shattered the porch post before she finished speaking. Splinters flew. Thomas ducked and fired back through the open frame. The crack of his shot vanished into the roar of the storm. The next minutes blurred into noise, and light gunfire, thunder, the sharp metallic ring of shells hitting the floor. Nizhoni crouched near the window, firing in clean, patient rhythm. Between shots, she whispered under her breath words Thomas couldn't make out. Prayers maybe, or names. When the shooting stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Thomas reloaded, breath steady. You hit anyone, she said. The horse screams. He listened. She was right. The sound came faint through the rain, fading fast. Then another voice shouting, the traitor, Mercer. You hand her over and walk away clean. You got my word. Thomas stepped into the doorway. Rain soaked his shirt, ran down the barrel of his rifle. Your word's worth less than the dirt you stand on. You'll die for her if I have to. The traitor spat a curse. Then, you die poor. The next shot came from the left, tearing into the wall beside Thomas's head. He fired back. Lightning flared, and for an instant he saw one of them fall into the mud. The others broke, retreating toward the ridge. The storm swallowed their hoofbeats. When it was over, the world seemed to exhale. The rain slowed to a whisper. Smoke rose from the rifle barrels, mingling with the steam of wet earth. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, chest heaving. His shoulder burned where a splinter had cut through skin. Nizhoni came to stand beside him. Her hair was plastered to her neck, her hands still shaking, though she hid it well. They'll come again, she said. He nodded. Not tonight. They lost a man. That buys us time. She looked up at him, eyes glinting in the half-light. You could have let them take me. He shook his head. Wouldn't have mattered. They'd have killed us both anyway. She studied him, then said softly, Then maybe we fight for the same reason now. He looked out toward the horizon. The clouds were breaking, streaks of pale blue showing through. What reason's that? To belong somewhere, she said. Even if it's only for a while. They spent the next day cleaning what was left of the fight. He buried the dead man by the creek. No name, no marker, just a pile of stones, and a prayer he didn't know how to say. Nizhoni mended the holes in the wall, her stitches small and even. By dusk, the cabin looked whole again. But both of them knew the illusion would not hold for long. She sat on the porch, sharpening a knife against a flat stone. You should leave, she said, before they bring more. He poured water over the steps, washing away the last of the blood. And let them come back to burn this place, she sighed. You think the cabin is home. He looked at her. Ain't it? She shook her head slowly. Home is who stands beside you when the wind turns mean. Thomas took a long breath. Then, I guess I've got one again. Her eyes flickered toward him, startled, then softened. The last light of evening spilled across the yard. The world smelled of rain and iron and cedar smoke. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured again, not threat now, but memory. Thomas set his rifle against the porch rail. They'll come again, he said. But next time we'll be ready. Nizhoni met his gaze, her voice steady. Then next time we won't run. The wind rose once more, sweeping across the mesa, carrying the scent of wet earth, and something else beneath it. Something new, fierce, unspoken. The storm had come and gone, but its mark remained, a promise, carved not in words, but in the land itself. And in that promise, for the first time, Thomas Mercer and Nizhoni stood not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals, two souls, bound by labor, by fire, and now by the threat that would not break them, only prove them. That night, thunder crawled over the mesa. Lightning split the horizon, lighting the corral like a brief memory of war. Thomas loaded shells by the fire, while Nizhoni packed what little she owned, a carved stone, a blanket, a pouch of seeds. She moved with calm precision, the way people do when fear has become a familiar guest. You could run, he said. She looked up. And leave you to fight your ghosts alone. He didn't answer. He only checked the rifle again. The wind rattled the shutters. Then came the sound, distant hoofbeats, two, maybe more. The traitor had brought company. Thomas blew out the lamp. Stay low. The first shot shattered the window. glass rained across the floor. Thomas fired once, the flash brief and violent. Outside, a horse screamed. Nizhoni crawled to the door, clutching the small pistol he'd given her days before. Lightning flickered. She saw the men moving toward the barn. Thomas. He turned in time to see one of them break through the side door, knife drawn. The fight was short and cruel, two men locked in silence except for breath and struggle. When it was done, the knife lay on the ground and Thomas was bleeding from the shoulder. "Leave it," he said when she tried to reach him. "Get to cover." But she didn't move. Instead, she knelt and pressed her hand against the wound, whispering something in Apache. Then she scooped a handful of earth from the floor and pressed it over the blood. "The land remembers," she said. "It will hold this, not you." Outside, the traitor was shouting curses, firing blindly. Rain began to fall slow and heavy, turning dust to mud. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised. Lightning framed him, a worn soldier against the storm. "This is your last chance," he called. The traitor laughed through the rain. "You think she's worth dying for?" Thomas took a breath, felt the weight of every year he'd lived wrong, and said, "No, I think she's worth living for." Then he fired. The sound tore through the valley, echoed, and was swallowed by thunder. When the smoke cleared, the traitor was gone from his horse, lying still in the wet clay. For a moment, there was nothing, just rain, firelight, and the ragged sound of breathing. Nizhoni stepped out beside him, rain running down her face. She said nothing, only reached up and touched his arm, her fingers warm against the wound. The storm began to fade. He looked at her then, at the horizon where the clouds were thinning. "It's over," he said. She shook her head gently. "No, now it begins." Dawn came shyly, like someone unsure she was welcome. The rain had passed, leaving the mesa wrapped in silver fog. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, forgiving line. The land smelled of wet earth, and iron of things returned to truth. Thomas stepped outside, shoulder-bound boots sinking slightly in the mud. The air was cool enough to sting, but clean, in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since the war, he wasn't waiting for another shot to be fired. By the corral, Nizhoni knelt, turning the soil with her bare hand. She had tied her hair back with a strip of his old shirt. Between her fingers were the seeds she had carried across deserts and bloodlines. She pressed each one down gently, whispering to the ground. When she noticed him watching, she said, "It must start again." He nodded, picked up a post that had fallen during the fight, and set it upright. Together, they rebuilt the fence, his hammer, her steady hands. Wood against metal, rhythm, slow as breathing. The sound of making peace. Afterward, he poured coffee, black and rough. Steam curled into the morning light. She sat across from him on the porch steps, wrapped in the wool blanket that once covered his bed. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer empty. It held the weight of survival. From the ridge came the call of a hawk. The wind shifted warm, now carrying the smell of sage and smoke. Thomas took off his hat, held it against his chest, and let the light touch his face. Nizhoni reached out, touched the ground once more, then looked at him. "The land knows you now," she said. "It remembers your name with mine." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it beside her. The small act said everything that words could ruin. They sat as the sun climbed higher, drying the last of the rain. In the distance, the mesas glowed red again, clean, defiant, alive. Thomas looked at the half-rebuilt corral, at the little patch of earth she'd planted, and felt something strange settle in his chest. It wasn't pride or relief. It was belonging, the quiet kind that doesn't ask permission. Nizhoni leaned her head against the post, eyes half closed. "You will stay?" she asked softly. He watched the horizon, the road, the wide sky that once meant escape. Then he said, "I think the road ends here." The wind moved between them, gentle, now lifting the smell of coffee and cedar. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured its last goodbye. When the sun finally cleared the clouds, the light fell on them both, warm, patient, the color of forgiveness. Thomas reached down, pressed his palm to the damp soil, and felt the earth pulse back. He whispered, "We're home." The wind carried the words away, but the land heard them. And in that quiet place on Lone Mesa, two broken souls became part of something that no longer needed saving. If this story reached you through the dust and the silence, let the dawn stay a little longer. Share it, follow the trail, and ride with us again. Out here, every sunrise tells another Wild West love story.